Gruinard Island, off the northwest coast of Scotland, 12th July, 1942. A small boat approaches the shore, and the men aboard are dressed as though preparing for battle rather than a scientific trial. They wear rubber suits, gas masks, and thick gloves. Ahead of them, tethered to stakes driven into the macaire grass, 60 sheep wait in the wind. Within a fortnight, every one of them will be dead. The men working on this remote, uninhabited island are scientists from Porton Down, Britain's chemical and biological research establishment. And what they are testing is not an explosive or a gas, but something older and in some ways far more frightening. They are testing anthrax. What happens on this island over the following weeks will be kept secret for nearly 50 years, and it will leave a patch of Scottish land so contaminated that it cannot be safely visited again until 1990. This is the story of Operation Vegetarian, a British plan to end the Second World War, not with tanks or bombers in the conventional sense, but by turning Germany's own food supply into a weapon against itself. It is a story about a bomb built not from steel and cordite, but from linseed cake, and about a decision that came so close to being made that 4 million of these lethal cattle cakes were manufactured and stored, ready to be dropped from the air. Why this weapon matters is simple. It represents the moment Britain seriously considered biological warfare on an industrial scale, and it forces an uncomfortable question that still echoes through modern defense policy. How far is a nation prepared to go when its survival feels genuinely at stake? By the middle of 1942, Britain's situation was grim enough to make such questions feel less like moral abstractions and more like practical necessities. The Battle of the Atlantic was at its most dangerous point, with German U-boats sinking merchant shipping faster than British and American shipyards could replace it. Rommel's forces had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, and with it, Britain's access to Middle Eastern oil. At home, rationing had tightened to the point where an average adult's weekly meat allowance amounted to roughly 450 grams, barely enough for 2 modest meals. The government's Scientific Advisory Committee, along with military planners at the War Office, were searching for any means of striking at Germany that did not require the men and material Britain simply did not have in surplus. Conventional bombing was proving expensive, and in the early years of the war, disappointingly inaccurate. Bomber Command's raids on German industrial targets often missed their marks by wide margins, and Germany's own agricultural base, feeding both its civilian population and its armed forces, remained largely untouched by anything Britain could throw at it. This mattered enormously because Germany's food situation, while not as dire as Britain's, was tightly managed and dependent on livestock that had already been reduced by wartime demands for labor and requisition. If that livestock could be destroyed on a mass scale, the reasoning went, the effect on German war production and civilian morale could rival or exceed the impact of a strategic bombing campaign, and it could be achieved with a fraction of the aircraft and none of the aircrew losses that bombing raids demanded. The existing options for economic warfare, blockade, sabotage, and diplomatic pressure on neutral suppliers were slow and only partially effective. Something faster and more direct was wanted, and the scientists at Porton Down believed they had found it in a disease that had killed livestock and farmers for centuries: anthrax. The man most closely associated with turning this idea into a workable weapon was Paul Fildes, a bacteriologist who led Porton Down's biology department from 1940 onwards. Fildes was an unusual figure even among wartime scientists, a former surgeon who had abandoned clinical medicine for microbiology, and who approached the problem of biological weapons with the same cold, methodical rigor he might have applied to any other engineering challenge. Working alongside him was a small team that included the chemist and bacteriologist team at the Porton Down Experimental Station in Wiltshire, operating under conditions of extreme secrecy, even by wartime standards. Their solution centered on Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, chosen because its spores are exceptionally hardy, capable of surviving in soil for decades, and because the disease was already well understood as a killer of grazing animals. The technical challenge was not identifying the pathogen, but finding a way to deliver it efficiently across a wide area, and to a species, cattle, that would actually consume it. The answer they devised was almost domestic in its simplicity. Linseed cattle cake was, and remains, a standard supplementary feed for livestock across Europe. An oily, compressed block, roughly the size and shape of a bar of soap, that farmers scattered across fields for their herds. Porton Down's scientists impregnated these cakes with anthrax spores, calculating that cattle grazing in open fields would encounter and eat the contaminated cake alongside their normal fodder within days. The plan, formally named Operation Vegetarian, called for the Royal Air Force to drop these cakes from bombers over pasture land across Germany, targeting cattle-rearing regions where the disease could spread from animal to animal and, crucially, into the human food chain through infected meat and milk. Each cake weighed only a few hundred grams, small enough that a single Lancaster bomber, adapted for the task, could carry and disperse tens of thousands of them across a single sortie. Manufacturing took place primarily in a converted facility, with the anthrax cultures themselves grown in specially designed fermentation vessels at Porton Down before being transferred to the cake production line. By early 1944, approximately 5 million of these cakes had been produced, though figures vary between 4 and 5 million depending on the source, a discrepancy that reflects both the secrecy surrounding the program and the destruction of many original records after the war. The cakes were stored at RAF Elvedon in Suffolk, packed and ready, awaiting only the political decision to authorize their use. That decision never came, at least not in the form the weapons designers anticipated. Operation Vegetarian existed almost entirely in a state of readiness rather than deployment, a loaded weapon left resting at the moment of firing. The trials on Gruinard Island in the summer of 1942 had already demonstrated with brutal clarity what the weapon could do. The sheep tethered there died within days of exposure, and the island itself became so saturated with anthrax spores that it was fenced off, marked with warning signs, and left uninhabited for decades. A small but permanent scar left by a weapon that was never actually used against an enemy. British planners intended Operation Vegetarian as a retaliatory measure, something to be unleashed only if Germany used biological or chemical weapons first, a doctrine of deterrence rather than offense. Winston Churchill himself was briefed on the program and reportedly viewed it as a legitimate response should Germany cross that particular line, though he showed considerably more enthusiasm for chemical weapons as a retaliatory tool than for anthrax specifically. The psychological weight of simply possessing such a capability was, in its own way, a form of use. knowledge of the program was restricted to an extraordinarily small circle within the War Cabinet and military high command. And even now, historians debate exactly how close Britain came to authorizing a strike. What is documented is that by 1944, as the Allies prepared for the Normandy landings and the tide of the war shifted decisively in their favor, the urgency that had driven the program's development began to fade. The immediate threat that Germany might resort to its own biological or chemical arsenal never materialized in the way British planners feared, and Operation Vegetarian was quietly shelved rather than dramatically abandoned, its stockpiled cakes eventually destroyed, and its existence buried within classified files that would not see daylight for nearly half a century. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is plenty more of this hidden history still to come. Germany, it turns out, had been pursuing remarkably similar ideas, though with considerably less success. German biological weapons research, centered at institutions including the Robert Koch Institute and various military medical facilities, explored pathogens including anthrax and glanders. But the program never achieved the scale or organization of its British counterpart. Hitler's personal ambivalence towards biological and chemical weapons, shaped partly by his own experience of gas warfare in the First World War, meant that German efforts remained comparatively underfunded and fragmented across competing agencies, rather than concentrated under a single driving scientific mind in the way Fildes had unified British research at Porton Down. The Japanese program, centered on the notorious Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria, was far more extensive and considerably more horrifying in its methods, involving direct experimentation on human subjects and documented use of biological agents against Chinese civilians and soldiers. A moral chasm that separates it entirely from the British approach of testing on sheep and never actually deploying the weapon against people. The American program, which began later and drew heavily on British research shared through wartime scientific exchange, would eventually surpass both in scale during the Cold War. But during the Second World War itself, America's biological weapons effort, centered at Camp Detrick in Maryland, remained largely experimental and dependent on British groundwork. In terms of raw capability at the height of the war, Britain's Operation Vegetarian stood as probably the most operationally ready biological weapons program among the major combatants, a stockpile sitting in Suffolk warehouses that, unlike its German or Japanese equivalents, could plausibly have been loaded onto bombers and used within days of a political decision to proceed. That readiness, more than any single technical innovation, is what made the British program distinctive, and it is precisely why its abandonment feels less like a triumph of restraint and more like a quiet, uneasy footnote to a war that came closer to biological escalation than most people ever realized. Assessing the actual impact of a weapon that was never used presents an obvious difficulty, and honest historical assessment has to sit with a considerable amount of uncertainty here. Operation Vegetarian killed no German cattle, infected no German civilians, and altered no battlefield outcome, because it was never deployed against Germany at all. Its only victims were the sheep on Gruinard Island, and the lasting physical legacy was confined to that one patch of Scottish coastline, which remained officially classified as contaminated ground until a decontamination effort in the late 1980s, using formaldehyde solution and the removal of topsoil, finally rendered it safe enough for the government to lift restrictions in 1990. The psychological impact, harder to measure but arguably more significant, lies in what the program reveals about wartime decision-making under existential pressure. Britain, a nation that would later become one of the strongest voices for biological weapons disarmament, spent the middle years of the Second World War manufacturing millions of anthrax-laced cattle cakes and genuinely debating whether to drop them on an enemy's farmland. That contradiction shaped post-war policy in tangible ways, contributing to Britain's eventual support for the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, an international treaty banning the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons, which Britain helped negotiate partly, historians suggest, from an institutional understanding of exactly how close the nation had once come to using such weapons itself. Gruinard Island today remains uninhabited, though safe, a quiet, grass-covered reminder, visible from the mainland road near Lod in Westeros, and the surviving documents relating to Operation Vegetarian are held at the National Archives in Kew, declassified in stages from the 1970s through to the 1990s. No cattle cakes survive as physical artifacts. The entire stockpile was destroyed, by most accounts through incineration, sometime after the program's cancellation, leaving behind only paperwork, laboratory notes, and the fenced-off memory of an island where sheep once died to prove a terrible idea could work. Return then to that boat approaching Gruinard's shore in July 1942. The scientists in their rubber suits, moving carefully among tethered sheep that had no understanding of what was about to happen to them. What they were witnessing was the birth of a weapon that Britain built, tested, manufactured by the million, stored, and ultimately never fired. It is tempting to call this restraint, and in the narrowest sense it was. A decision was made, consciously or through drift and changing circumstance, not to cross the threshold into biological warfare against Germany. But restraint suggests a battle resisted. And the truth of Operation Vegetarian is stranger and more uncomfortable than that. The weapon was not abandoned because anyone judged it too disturbing to use. It was shelved because the war's momentum shifted before the order came, because the deterrent it was designed to answer never materialized, because circumstances changed faster than the moral question could be forced. 4 million cattle cakes sat in Suffolk warehouses, not as a monument to conscience, but as a loaded gun that simply never needed firing. Britain built the capability to poison an enemy's food supply on a continental scale, tested it thoroughly enough to leave a Scottish island contaminated for nearly 50 years, and kept that capability secret for almost as long precisely because its existence sat so uneasily alongside the nation's later moral positioning on biological warfare. What Operation Vegetarian ultimately proves is not that Britain was uniquely villainous, nor that it was uniquely restrained, but that total war strips away the comfortable distance between what a nation would do and what a nation is capable of doing when survival itself feels uncertain. The scientists at Porton Down were not monsters. They were methodical, careful men, solving a problem exactly as they had been asked to. And that is precisely what makes the story unsettling. It did not take villainy to build this weapon. It took only pressure, ingenuity, and time, the same ingredients that produce every weapon in every war. And the only thing that separated Operation Vegetarian from the bombs that did fall on Germany was a margin of circumstance so thin it barely qualifies as a decision at all. the sheep on Gruinard Island died to answer a question Britain hoped it would never have to ask for real. And the answer, sitting quietly in those Suffolk warehouses for 2 years, was that the weapon would have worked. It never needed to. That, in the end, is the whole of the story, and perhaps the most disturbing part of all.